Ending impunity, how do you call people to account? It's going to be a great discussion. I've engaged with almost all of the panel speakers in the course of my work. John McGuinness, TD, who's chair of the Committee of Public Accounts, Imelda Higgins, barrister, and she's an adjunct lecturer in corruption at Trinity and an advisor to the Mahon Tribunal. And your new book is coming out shortly, Corruption Law. Shelley Horan, another barrister who's actually written for us in the Irish Independent. He's a specialist in corporate, white collar and regulatory crime. And Shane Kilcommins, who we've had a long discussion about white collar crime. Shane actually is in the back of my book. He inspired one of the anecdotes, and it struck me actually. I did write a book 2 years ago on how the courts were dealing with the fallout of the financial crisis, and many of the stage villains and others were featured in that book, some of whom are now before the courts. And shortly before the book came out, when we were going through the legal read, where the lawyers were going through it to check for any potential defamation or any prejudicial content, I had a mild panic attack because many of the people featured in the book were possibly due to come before the courts at some stage. And I remember ringing a senior Garda contact and going, what about A, B and C? What if they're arrested before my book comes out? And after several minutes of laughter, he said, don't worry, that's not going to trouble you. And he was right. But I suppose that there's a lot of frustration amongst members of the public. We see a lot of activity, particularly in the financial world, where if it's not quite criminal, it certainly feels as much, and there's a lot of anger and frustration at how slow the wheels of justice turn, if they turn at all, in this field. And I suppose maybe the first question I might ask you, Shane, is, do you have a culture where we prosecute white-collar crime, and how serious as a state do we take it?
I think certainly in the past we didn't take it seriously. I often start, if I'm giving a lecture on white-collar crime in UCC, I'll often start by giving an example of the Merchant Bank in 1982, which collapsed owing 30 million, and 592 depositors back then lost their deposits, and despite detailed findings in reports, liquidated reports and so on, of wrongdoing, embezzlement, bribery, false accounting and so on, no conviction took place here in Ireland. A conviction did take place in Northern Ireland, but not here in the south. And so, I would go on then, I would detail different examples. Paul Carney in 1990, the Irish Times, talking about when the Irish Fraud Squad met those accused of white collar crimes, would be he called it a genteel confrontation. We had Shane Ross in the Shannon in the late 1980s again, talking about insider trading and it not being flagged. A very famous penal report in 1985, the Whittaker report, which was a very, very comprehensive document. Back in 1985, in Ireland, it detailed that the amount of white-collar crime was 9 times that of stolen goods that were being stolen every year in Ireland. And yet we had a very, very kind of blasé attitude to it. Now I suppose, and even then, another example, the McDonald report in 1998, had a very famous phrase: the sound of the enforcer's footsteps are never heard on the doorsteps. So, definitely in the past, it would be fair to say that there was absolutely no commitment to prosecuting or enforcing white-collar crime. Today, I think there's 2 issues, and actually just to pick up on kind of topics that were discussed in the last session. I think one is the issue of awareness. I think the crisis that has occurred and so on, more people now are aware of the threat to our security that is posed by regulatory wrongdoing or white-collar wrongdoing. But I still think that there's an issue in place in civic society. I'm not so sure to what extent it extends. And people would point to the banking sector and say, yes, it's true there. But I remember coming home from work one night listening to a radio station, and they were discussing a tax case where an individual who defrauded the revenue of 2 million and got a 6-year sentence. And the argument was, but this is ridiculous. If you compare it with rape offences or sexual assault offences and so on, there was no victim in this case. And so I know I can't gauge it. It's very, very difficult to kind of put a figure on it. But there does still seem to be a lack of awareness generally about what white collar crime is and how committed we are actually to dealing with it. It's all right when it's, when everybody's against, bank fraud and so on at the highest level, but to what extent are we against it when it reflects on our own lives? And that's still an issue. And the second issue, and I'll just mention this very quickly, is putting it. I mean, I think that we are putting a structure in place, but it's the issue of commitment. And again, this was touched upon by Inspector DPP's office previously. Is putting the commitment in place. I mean, our justice system is meant to be changing, and we are so white collar crime is now on the agenda. But I think very often our agencies and our institutions are still very much stuck in the police, prisons, prosecutions mode, which is designed really for ordinary crime in the streets as opposed to crime in the suites. And I think that reshaping institutional thinking around that is going to still take a while.
I shamelessly used that phrase from Sheehan, crime in the suites versus crime in the suites quite liberally. I cover the courts a lot, and I know a lot of the time it's maybe the superior courts, but if you go into the circuit criminal court, Shelley, and even in the district court, it's not that we don't prosecute fraud, it's not that we don't prosecute offences of that nature, it's just that what we seem to get is very, very low level stuff, and stuff where it's so apparent that a fraud has been created. So you see a lot of maybe kind of social welfare, that kind of stuff, or maybe somebody in a workplace. But it strikes me sometimes that, is it the lack of laws that we have, or are there, because obviously, we have a very broad and general theft and fraud offences, which you think would be a catch-all thing that would catch everyone in. But what do we need in terms of improving our system of prosecuting the high-level white-collar crime? Is there anything that, if you had a wish list as Justice Minister or DPP, that you would be requesting?
Well, I mean, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. I mean, it's not a question of a lack of law. I mean, we have actually an enormous amount of legislation on statute books dealing with white-collar type offences. So if I had a wish list, and something that I've been advocating for quite a lot myself, is that we would actually just conduct a wholesale review of our systems in place to deal with white-collar crime. The United Kingdom back in 2008 engaged an American New York prosecutor, a woman called Jessica de Grazia, to look at the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom and to ascertain whether it was effective in what it was doing when compared to the American system. And she concluded that a number of reforms were required in the UK, and we have to remember that the UK are far more developed and advanced in this area than the Irish enforcers are. And I think that something like that is required in Ireland. I think that we do need to look at our systems. I mean, the reality is that what happens here is that you tend to have some kind of financial crisis, some kind of white-collar scandal, and then a measure of public outcry which will put pressure on the legislature to introduce some kind of piecemeal reform which may not actually deal with the underlying problem, which is a lack of resources. Are our enforcers adequately trained or experienced to deal with these type of large-scale and very, very complicated frauds? And I certainly think that kind of a study or review would be very effective in Ireland.
But are there any kind of individual measures that you would support or would like to see brought in?
Well, I think that we should certainly consider things like the deferred prosecution agreement, which the Americans use, but I think has just recently been proposed in the United Kingdom. I think, in fact, there's a bill that's going to go through Parliament in the United Kingdom advocating a deferred prosecution agreement. And effectively, what that allows enforcers to do is to say, well, look, we are going to levy a charge against you, but we will defer prosecution in the event of your complying with the breach. So that will allow some kind of perhaps like a monetary sanction to be imposed. It might entail some kind of monitoring by the enforcer. They might put somebody in position in a company to monitor its compliance, much like they did, for example, with Siemens, who were prosecuted by the Department of Justice in the United States for breaches of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And the Americans managed to secure somebody to work within Siemens for a number of years, monitoring their compliance with anti-corruption measures. So something like deferred prosecution agreements would be worthwhile as a consideration. Also, sentencing guidelines. I mean, we've seen a very erratic approach to sentencing in Ireland recently. I remember when I first started teaching white-collar crime, we used to have a sort of a table that I'd produce which showed the high number of suspended sentences that were imposed for white-collar cases. Now, recently we've seen in the Murray case a sentence of 12 years being reduced to 9 for social welfare fraud, and not at a huge scale. I think the amount involved was about $250,000, which isn't massive in terms of white collar crime, certainly what we've seen in recent years. Then followed the Begley decision where we saw 6 years, then we saw 6 years. So suddenly there's a landscape change, an attitude shift in terms of sentencing white collar crime. And I think anecdotally I've heard that the same day that Begley was sentenced, there was somebody in the Circuit Criminal Court being prosecuted for a drugs offence under Section 15A of the Misuse of Drugs Act. And that offence would normally attract a mandatory minimum of 10 years, but that individual got a suspended sentence. And we've also seen Tony Lyons, for example, getting what's being considered to be a very low-level sentence for what's considered to be a violent sexual attack. So there is a bit of a disparity. I'm not going to say that we absolutely need sentencing guidelines. I know that's a controversial proposition, but I think it's something that we should at least consider, and particularly in the realm of white collar crime, so that there's some kind of uniformity of principle being adopted. So they're just two examples of the kind of things I think we need.
Good stuff. And now the white collar criminals compared to maybe the ordinary criminals that Shane has referred to are quite adept at covering their tracks, at conducting their business and trying to, breach that opaqueness about what they do to get transparency can be very, very difficult, and no doubt it's one of the difficult reasons why we don't prosecute in this area. I know that one of your main interests, or one of you think that could be a great potential to end that impunity, or at least to circumvent it, would be to have greater transparency in the area of, for perhaps, freedom of information, which we've filleted since we've introduced it, although there might be some hope about expanding the number of bodies covered. What do you think from a transparency perspective needs to be done in order to because it strikes me that white collar criminals don't fear a sentence, it's detection. And do you think that increased transparency might be able to kind of bring them into the fold?
I think to increase accountability, there's essentially three things you need to look at. The first thing is, how do you get information that a possible offence has been committed? Secondly, what do you do with that information once you get it? And thirdly, how is that information handled when it goes to the investigation and prosecution authorities? The first issue clearly brings transparency right into the limelight, because unless there's transparency and unless you know why decisions are made, who is making them, and the reasons upon which those decisions are based, then information about offences is not going to come into the public domain. So that brings us smack into the middle of the Freedom of Information Act and the necessity to recognise the fundamental principle that all documents should be in the public domain unless it is in the public interest that those documents be kept confidential. And that the whole Freedom of Information Act should operate on that premise. And there should be no class-based exemptions from that act. There should be, for example, the police. In certain circumstances, it may be in the public interest to have access to criminal investigations. So while it is planned to extend the Freedom of Information Act to cover the administrative side of the police, it is not planned to cover other aspects. And I think that is incompatible with transparency and the ability to investigate corruption effectively, because corruption can happen in those domains. But it's broader than freedom of information. Michael Smith mentioned public education. In order to know whether offences or corruption is being committed, then the public needs to be aware of what constitutes corruption and what constitutes proper and what constitutes improper behaviour. So that's another part of it, and I would absolutely second his proposal that the schools should be involved in teaching what constitutes appropriate behaviour, so that when students come to vote, that they understand how to keep our politicians democratically accountable. I think then, getting to the next level, you go back to Shelley's point, if you have deferred prosecution agreements, then it's much more likely that companies will self-report, bringing crime again into the public domain. Similarly, you could have immunity programs, leniency programs. There's some suggestions for asymmetric punishment for bribery on the basis that the person who offers the bribe may not be as culpable as the person who receives the bribe, particularly when the bribe is in the public sector. And that's another issue that might be worth looking at. And then obviously you need to get to the prosecution aspect of it, and there you have increased transparency between the agencies themselves so that they actually cooperate and that they exchange information. For example, you have conflicts of interests declarations on the part of public officials. Ideally they should form the basis of police Garda investigations in the event that there is a discrepancy between somebody's lifestyle and their known sources of income. And that would require Standards and Public Office Commission talking to the Gardaí, etc. And then finally you have identifying the basis for imposing corporate liability and identifying beneficial ownership, which is a significant problem in white-collar crime. So,
sorry, I have it. That issue about awareness, which was raised earlier, I wholeheartedly agree with that. But I think it's not just in respect of awareness as regards the type of politicians we want and who we vote for. I think it's awareness about all sorts of misconduct in society, and so it can relate to environmental wrongdoing, financial wrongdoing, wrongdoing in respect of revenue and so on, so that people have a very, very broad understanding of how security of civic duty, but also how security in society is threatened. We seem to have I often ask my students about this in Cork at Masters level, how is your security threatened every day? And most of them will come back with, well, it's going to be organised crime and so on. And then you distill it down, you break it down and say, well, look, think about your everyday activities and so on. How is your security threatened then? And they'll give you very, very different responses. But I think that to date we've adopted, as I said, a very narrow understanding of what our security is comprised of.
Well, I think what the financial crisis has shown, and Ocean has written and spoken on this, is that that a threat to that was posed by the banking, by the financial crisis, is a serious threat to our social and economic order, as perhaps perhaps in the past where you may be pointing the finger at the bogeyman of terrorism or dissident activity, but in its own way, the financial crisis and the near collapse of the banking system has shown itself, and we don't see. I think sometimes the victims, you might see someone maybe shot on the street, but we don't realise that the victims of a financial crisis, when all of those measures trickle down, whether it's in health and education, it has huge knock-on effects. And I think that we're only really beginning to kind of realise that. John McGuinness, I want to just ask you, just because we were discussing the Freedom of Information Act and the lack of transparency. As a working journalist, I find that it is sometimes, not all departments, but sometimes next to impossible, working on behalf of the public interest and in the public interest, to get access to information that A, we're entitled to anyway, and B, for which there is no justification for putting a near blanket ban on coverage. And that makes our job as journalists very, very difficult. And it seemed to me that when the Freedom of Information Act came in, and horrendously it was filleted down through the ages, that people seemed that instead of a culture of transparency, in some cases it meant that people stopped writing things down, that they ignored their duty to keep things down, and everyone is as mystified about the banking, the night of the banking guarantee as anyone else. In your view, what would you do to enhance that, maybe that culture of not wanting to be transparent, and where do you see that lack of accountability replicated across the political system?
Well, first of all, you have to deal with the Freedom of Information Act and the legislation that's there and the legislation that's currently going through the House. You can have that legislation, it can be enacted, and it can be there, and you can use it. But in the using of it, you are reliant on departments and their interpretation of the Act, their judgment in relation to the information that they will give you out. And more often than not, the information that you get arising from an FOI request will be extremely limited. Because, in my opinion, in terms of the bureaucracy of this, they limit the type of information that they store, and therefore that they can refer to or will refer to in the context of FOI. If you look at the parliamentary question system, which is something I've raised, and indeed TDs when they're in opposition raise it, but when they go into government, and this can be said of my party or any other party, it becomes a different story. Parliamentary questions are rarely answered in their fullest. They rarely give the total amount of information that you actually ask for. And for me, that is hugely damaging to democracy, because it means that the members of Parliament who are seeking the information for one reason or another are not being given that information. They're being deprived of a source of information in order for them to carry out some part of their duties one way or the other. And therefore, they fail the public also. I find that to be very damaging to the Dáil, very damaging to democracy, and it makes me think that within bureaucracy there is a culture of ducking and diving when it comes to delivering the information in a very clear way. Public accounts gives the opportunity to examine witnesses across from you and extract from them in a very public way, in a very public platform, and they cannot escape giving the answers. But it's wrong that they have to be dragged kicking and screaming to delivering the answer. The example in relation to the bank guarantee is this, that we set out as a Public Accounts Committee to establish what did happen. What happened in the lead up to the guarantee? What happened in terms of policy, in terms of who informed the direction of that policy, who attended the meetings, and so forth. And really what has happened in terms of the information that the public should know about, that the members of Parliament should know about, is that it has been, if you like, sidelined. Because out of the banking inquiry document that we provided for government, a ways and means of doing this, it has never surfaced for debate in the Dáil. My position as chairman of the Public Accounts was questioned as to whether, because I'm a Fianna Fáil person, I actually was credible at all to carry out this inquiry. So anything and everything is used to prevent the information being dragged and put out into the public domain. And as a result of that, as the years go by, the recollection of what happened on those nights, because information is not written down as widely as it was in the past, begins to blur. You have a blurred vision of what happened back then. The people who were central to it, the officials, for example, how do you get them back from Europe or wherever else they are in terms of their retirement or their promotion, and they're gone elsewhere? So there is almost an attempt continuously being made by the permanent government, I would suggest, to limit the amount of information that goes out into the public domain. And I'll finish by saying this, that the Dirt inquiry is often referred to. Well, the Dirt inquiry was an arrangement whereby all players came to that table. They came in a voluntary fashion. So compatibility was never questioned. And the state was never in the box. It was the ordinary citizen that was targeted in that. So it's fine and dandy to target the citizen of the state, but when you're targeting bureaucracy and individuals within that structure, well, now that's a completely different task.
Yeah, and I was actually maybe going to follow up, because obviously people have huge respect for the work of the PAC and share the frustration that they're not able to do more. For my own part, I was a vocal opponent of the Oireachtas Inquiries referendum and was thrilled to see it go down. And it wasn't, again, that I didn't think that the Public Accounts Committee shouldn't be able to do what other very strong parliamentary inquiries should. I just felt that the balance, that uncertainty created about whether or not you would be able to defend yourself or have your in re hohi rights, that's what swung it for me. But in terms of, when a lot of people are calling out for a banking inquiry, I've been covering the Quinn case quite a lot, sort of kept me in a job for the past little while. But one of the things that struck me is that the best opportunity in the absence of a parliamentary one is in fact the civil case between the former Anglo-Irish Bank and the Quinn family. I think in the absence of everything else that possibly represents the best chance, because I think it's through that civil litigation that we may actually, through that court process, get the witnesses, get the discovery and get everything else that we need. But of course, Sheena, it shouldn't take that. It shouldn't take something like that to try and flush it out inadvertently. What do you think we could do that, because obviously the public are very frustrated and annoyed, is there anything that we could do to enhance, public investigation into matters of huge public interest?
Well, Dearbhail, you say it shouldn't take it, but and I agree with you. But if you look at it as a pragmatic response in the ordinary criminal justice system, we have recognised increasingly the efficiencies that can be produced through going down through allowing the flow of power into the civil sphere. So if you think, for example, the Criminal Assets Bureau is often cited as a brilliant example about how we tackle, organised crime. That it's the due process safeguards are diluted somewhat, so the burden of proof switches automatically from beyond reasonable doubt to the balance of probabilities. Straight away, the issue of competence and compellability doesn't arise. Both parties are required to attend and to give evidence, particularly if they want to win their case. And so it just it changed the dynamic dramatically, became a very efficient means of examining wrongdoing and without even requiring a criminal conviction. And so and this has been in the whole issue of regulatory crime, white collar crime, we see different stakeholders making different points. So for example, people like the former DPP would argue that we should have be able to use administrative powers that go beyond the courts altogether, so that you have an administrative agency making findings and so on. Now that raises constitutional issues, so we haven't seemed to been able to get beyond that yet. But hybrid enforcement mechanisms that can combine civil and criminal does to me seem like a very useful strategy. And I suppose, and just kind of on that point, they often talk about a kind of a pyramid enforcement mechanism, where at the bottom of the pyramid, for any misconduct, that you're often dealing with, it's negotiation, consultation, dialogue. And as you go up along then through the pyramid, it gets more serious, so the imposition of civil penalties and so on. And it's only at the top, as a last resort mechanism, that you use the criminal law for the most serious cases, or for those that won't engage through a process of consultation and dialogue. But I would have no difficulty in, I think a kind of an approach that combines hybrid mechanisms is appropriate.
Imelda, the murder of Veronica Guerin and the events that preceded it led in part to the establishment of the Criminal Assets Bureau, and there was a huge political as well as a public will to tackle the problems surrounding that. People might argue, well, we have a Director of Corporate Enforcement, we have a DPP, we have the Criminal Assets Bureau, which hasn't been used, in fact, from what I can see, in any of this. Is there anything that you would propose we could strengthen in that area to strengthen the investigative powers that would lead to greater enforcement? Should it be across a disparate, group of entities? There's a lot of regulatory bodies where we've no shortage of them, and yet they still don't seem able to pull the punch when required.
Very difficult question.
That's fine.
To repeat a point that Shelley made, essentially, I would share your belief that our regulatory framework is very robust. I mean, people have asked what has happened about corruption, or they asked in the last session. Between 1926 and 1994, there were no major changes in our corruption law. Since 1994, we've had controls over money laundering, controls over ethics, controls over political finance, freedom of information, and 4 amendments to the Bribery Acts, and now a new consolidated corruption scheme coming through. So there's been an awful lot that's happened on the legislative front. Clearly there remains weaknesses in how that is being constructively used, or the uses to which it is being put. There are people who think that having a single anti-corruption agency is the way to remedy the deficiencies that we have, and you would have a highly specialised body, perhaps with competences in both areas of prevention and prosecution. And there are certainly advantages to that model, in particular because it means that information that leads to prosecutions can feed back into reforms outside of the criminal courts. The UN, however, thinks that the same job can be fulfilled by multiple agencies as long as those agencies cooperate and share information. And one of the problems in this jurisdiction is we don't actually know what's happening in our agencies. There's very few statistics being published. We don't know how many offences are being prosecuted. We don't know what complaints are being made to the Gardaí. We don't know what files are being sent to the DPP. We simply don't know. And without that knowledge, we can't actually even constructively criticise what's happening at the moment.
Shelley, maybe, we have very, very few prosecutions at our convictions that have led to jail sentences at that very, very high level. But it strikes me sometimes that maybe we're looking in the wrong place if we're looking for a kind of a big bang solution to all of this. One of the, and it's outlined very in detail in the report, one innovation that was brought in was this slight tweak in the legislation to compel reluctant witnesses to come forward, that you would have an ongoing obligation of discovery, and that has sent, I know from speaking to contacts, that lawyers and others, that this has kind of sent shockwaves through the business community and indeed others, that it's not just what you knew in the past, but that you would have this ongoing obligation to discover. It happened similarly in a criminal context when people were refusing to swear up on the initial statements that they gave to Gardaí, so that was very successful. In a gangland context, are there little things perhaps that we could do, like procedural things like that really could enhance it and bring greater compellability and greater accountability in that sphere?
Yes, I mean, I think the answer to that is that there are, and I think Kate, you mentioned earlier Bradley Birkenhead, and the one thing that wasn't said about him was that he actually received, as far as I recall, $104 million by way of a settlement or a reward from the IRS in the United States, because he had whistleblown on tax evasion conduct in the Swiss bank UBS. So there's kind of a development or a trend in the United States now for whistleblower bounties, which sound quite controversial, especially when you consider the risk of bad faith, incentivising bad faith reporting. But it does seem to be working. I mean, there was the Dodd-Frank Act has also introduced whistleblower bounties, the idea being that if you come forward with a legitimate white-collar offence, you could be given up to 1/3 of the amount of money that's recouped to the American state by virtue of your disclosure. And I think the first such whistleblower bounty that was awarded under the Dodd-Frank Act happened maybe in July or August of this year, and the individual got, I think, €150,000 back. And then the Bradley Birkenhead example is 104 million, which is quite a huge amount, and I'm sure that they are inundated now with people coming forward with complaints about white collar crime. So that might sound like a controversial approach, but it is working in the United States. And again, I mean, it's something that could just at least be considered here. I mean, why not consider it? I mean, maybe we'll decide it's not appropriate, but at least let's have that review.
Shane.
Yeah, I agree with what Shelley and Imelda have said, that any tinkering that's going to take place from now on will be largely confined, I think, to the periphery. A structure has been put in place. If you consider, for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a centralised, the state monopolised investigative and prosecutorial functions. So the Gardaí investigated crime and the DPP's office prosecuted crime. And now what we've seen, and it's kind of just echoing the point that Imelda said, that we've had a mushrooming of regulatory agencies with powers to investigate and prosecute. So if you think about the Environmental Protection Agency, the Competition Authority, the Health and Safety Authority, the Office of Director of Corporate Enforcement, Director of Consumer Affairs, there's a multitude of agencies now.
And yet very few of them, Shane, can prosecute in their own right beyond a certain level, because after that the DPP has to step in.
But what they do have is, and they have brought the range of expertise to bear in this, so they understand these issues better. They can prosecute summarily, and then they can pass cases on to the DPP's office afterwards. And this goes back to a point, and I just two points on this. One is, people think that that we don't have enough offences on the calendar and so on. But in company law alone, we have over 400 criminal law offences, and they range from failure to put a nameplate on the door, which is a really summary offence, right through to insider trading. So there's a huge range of criminal offences that are already in place. We have detention periods. We've talked about suspending. We have put into the White Collar Crime Act of 2011, suspending detention periods and so on. So a lot has been done. But what I suppose the next step as well is transparency across the agencies. So you have a whole variety of different agencies. Are they all operating the same policies in terms of prosecution, in terms of investigation, and so on, in terms of passing information on to the DPP? Do we have that information from them in terms of offences being prosecuted? And there still seems to be in Ireland, and it's amazing to say this, but commentators do. We had a better system of gathering statistical information on crime in the 19th century, in Victorian model. That's Professor Imelda Higgins UCD has said this repeatedly, than we do today. And even before we had this presentation here today, Sheila was talking to me about trying to get data on ODCE and so on, and what statistics were right, and the statistics from Pulse are different from what's in the reports. We still have those problems. How can you have evidence-based policies without the basic information of statistics? That's still a problem. And so I don't know what else to say beyond that, but that is a serious issue.
I want to leave some time. I'm going to let John answer it, and then I'm going to leave some time for questions, and then I'll just two quick questions actually for the lady lawyers on the panel. But John, you wanted to pick up there?
I just wanted to make the point that I agree there is not a big bang solution. We actually have the solution. The legislation, the agencies are all in place.
Yeah.
And what we need is a shift in culture for these people who head up those agencies, who are the leaders in all of that area, to stand up behind a political leadership which is a bit lacking right now, right across the political parties, to say that this is wrong and we will not tolerate it and we're going to make a complaint or we're going to bring some sort of charge or other. I think the Ombudsman's office has been particularly good in a lot of that area, and we need to see more of that. For example, in public accounts, we have the Public Accounts Committee, but actually it can't look at €4.5 billion worth of spend every year through local government. So we should empower the institutions, the agencies that we already have in place, and allow them to do their job and give the political leadership that's necessary to say, if it's wrong, it's wrong. Today there's 4,500 people in the various prisons in Ireland, and I doubt if there's that many in there for white collar crime. So I'm not saying that, you know, that's just my general view on it. I think that tells its own story. And if you look at the pieces of legislation, how many of those pieces of legislation have actually been acted upon to take some form of action against a wrongdoer? Not many.
Fines and civil debts, maybe, to clog up our prisons. One more question for Imelda and Shelley, just before I hand it over to the floor. Without prejudice, obviously, to any of the matters before the courts at the moment in respect of the Anglo investigation, people are just kind of, their minds boggle when they realise how long it takes. You know, that the DPP can't act until the Gardaí complete their files, and the Guards have huge volumes of files, and the High Court was very, very critical of the length of delays and made certain interventions every time the Director of Corporate Enforcement was seeking extensions of that. And I know it's a controversial question, prosecutors kind of sometimes get a bit excited about it, but should the DPP in and of itself have investigative powers, or should we be sending the lawyers that are ultimately going to be prosecuting these offences or these potential offences, should they be going in and working at a much, much earlier stage with the DPP to expedite cases? Because, you know, huge volumes of files, and in the end, as we've seen again, without prejudice to any of the matters, the three people that have been brought before the courts are being brought forward on one net issue.
So far. Well, I've been advocating for the consideration of a designated fraud office here. So rather than having our DPP inundated with all breeds of white collar or conventional crime and white collar crime, that maybe we should have what the equivalent of a serious fraud office in the United Kingdom. So one designated body that would both investigate and prosecute serious fraud, which is what happens in England. Because at the moment we have a very layered and fragmented approach. We have a number of bodies. The Director of Corporate Enforcement can, for example, investigate offences under the Companies Act and offences under the Companies Act only. So, for example, not partnerships, not building societies, only entities established under the Companies Act. They can prosecute summarily, but if they want a prosecution taken on indictment, they have to refer a file to DPP and hope that the DPP will decide to prosecute. They also rely very heavily sometimes on the assistance of the Garda Síochána. So that is a very slow approach. We know, I think there's a statistic out there that it's taking about a year for a case to get on in the Circuit Criminal Court. The DPP recently gave a statement whereby she said that she is suffering from a lack of resources, that it is taking her a long time to, or it will ultimately cause a reduction in the amount of prosecutions they can take. We know the Director of Corporate Enforcement had its resources cut last year, and that most of its time is occupied by the Anglo investigation, and therefore there's been kind of a shortage of or a fall in the number of prosecutions that it's been taking recently. So I mean, I think there's a number of problems, and my own view is that we need to consider whether we need a designated fraud office. I'm not sure whether the DPP could really be asked to investigate as well with the amount of resources that she has at the moment.
Okay,
I think certainly having something like the Serious Fraud Office could work very well. I mean, and the other point is that white collar crime investigations tend to be extremely complex. They tend to rely significantly on following documentary trails, in investigating corporate entities where there can be a lack of transparency over who is accountable or who is responsible for what within that entity. And I don't necessarily think that our authorities are any slower than those in other jurisdictions. And in addition, there's also, in both the UK and the USA, there has been some very high-profile cases which have collapsed because they have been inadequately prepared for trial. And that has had huge implications both for public relations and also the cost of those inquiries, which ultimately led to nowhere. So there's also a belt and braces approach to investigations is a very good idea, even if the public does get impatient with the length of time.
Okay, well, like the panel, there's been a lot of nodding heads in the audience, and I'm sure people have questions that they're to ask. Maybe if you wish to ask a question, maybe stand up, identify yourself, and maybe direct it to which member of the panel you'd like to speak to.
It's more of a general point in relation to the GPP. There's been some criticism of her office, more historically than related to the Civic Director. I understand reading a press report that she launched her annual report for 2011 this morning, and what she's reporting that her throughput is up to over 16,000 prosecutions. Her budget has been slashed by 4.3 million, down to a mere 36 million. And she's complaining that her office is fully stretched and that she cannot sustain that level of throughput. Now, in the context of a report which shows that white-collar crime and corruption is costing somewhere between 3 billion and 4 billion annually, is not one of the clear, most straightforward, small solutions that we've done if the enforcement bodies, as recommended by Progress Report 4, if they are properly funded, and would it not be an easy way of, well, not generating revenue, but would certainly be money well spent? I don't know if that's a matter for the Public Accounts Committee or otherwise.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree with you. You have the agencies there, they're acting in a particular way and you're expecting a job of work to be completed, and the budget has to be made available. That's a fact. Public accounts, in my opinion, would be exactly the same. But yet, for example, the Public Accounts Committee does not have the staff to forensically examine some of the agencies that come under its remit. And if it had, we could have saved the state millions of euro. Those millions of euro then could easily have been directed towards the provisions that you're talking about, rather than the cuts. And we need to get that balance right. And the question has to be asked, regardless of what party is in power, what is the political priority? What do you prioritise? And within the area that we're talking about, I suggest that those that are doing this type of work that we are describing should be given priority and therefore should be given funding, and it should be ring-fenced.
Sorry, just on that. Trevor. Again, it goes back to the issue that John talked about leadership. I mean, in programmes for government and so on, white-collar crime is now being flagged as being an important issue. If you look at policy statements by the Gardaí and so on, for the first time they're putting white-collar crime as part of the top of their agenda. But the problem is, if you're not committing the resources to it, then it's just rhetoric. That's the difficulty. So it is a leadership issue.
Carl Dolan, Transparency International EU office. There seemed to be a consensus on the panel that the increased use of deferred prosecutions in civil cases was a good thing for the toolkit. But what about the view that, for example, while they're useful in bringing more cases to light and successfully prosecuting some cases, or civil cases anyway, that in fact they have zero or limited deterrent effect? And that, in fact, one of the few things that will have a deterrent effect, and particularly in financial or corporate crime, is putting individuals into jail. And I'm thinking in particular of, for example, the SEC and Department of Justice cases in the case of mortgage fraud in the US, where we have record fines of 550 million imposed on Goldman Sachs, for example. But in context, that's 10 days profits for Goldman Sachs. So in a sense, they're parking fines. So I guess that's a question to the lawyers on the panel.
There's no doubt that fines can sometimes represent a blip on a company's balance sheet. That sometimes it's more cost effective for them to commit the offence notwithstanding that they may be penalised. And the best example of that is the Ford Pinto scandal from the 1970s, where they were aware that the gas tank was placed in a dangerous location, but they conducted a cost-benefit analysis, decided that the amount that they would make by selling the car in terms of profit would outweigh the amount that they would incur lest there be any civil or criminal prosecutions against them in respect of any fatal injuries. But the outcome actually works the opposite way for Ford. Not only was their damage, or their reputation very heavily damaged, but also the amount that they had to pay out was very, very substantial, and it was very, very damaging for the company ultimately, and it's still talked about today. So, I mean, I think, yes, you're right, there are questions about what is an effective deterrent. I mean, personally, we've seen increases in a lot of custodial sentences in the courts. We also see it on our statute books as well. I mean, corruption, where the proposed criminal justice corruption bill will increase custodial sentences. We're going to have unlimited fines. I don't think that an individual contemplating committing a white-collar offence will look at, for example, market manipulation and say, oh, the maximum fine will be 10 million, I'm not going to do this. But I think there's an element of truth in what you said, that if you do see people actually going to jail or actually paying high fines, that might amount to a greater deterrent than actually just having these crazy or very, very high level sanctions on our statute books that are just window dressing, that are not put into practice as often as they should be.
I think the issue you raised, the deterrent effects of imprisonment is an interesting one. You know, we do it all the time in the ordinary criminal justice system, and you know, in the ordinary criminal justice system we work off the assumption that the persons who are going to prison, that they're making rational choices about the offence that they've done. And empirically it's been proven that that's not in fact the case, that they very often don't make rational choices, a whole variety of reasons as to why they committed the crimes. Where people do, and this has been empirically tested, where people do make rational choices is in the white-collar crime field. Are they more likely to make rational choices? And so it does become an issue of cost-benefit analysis, and if the feeling is that they won't go to prison, then there's a possibility that they will commit the crime. So imprisonment as a deterrent effect, it seems to work better in the white-collar crime field than it does in the ordinary crime field. So that's a justification for using imprisonment in the white-collar crime field. And I've been on the record as saying this. Others would argue, including my boss in UCC, which not always being easy, but would argue that you should never use imprisonment for white-collar crime, that where possible, it's a neoliberal approach, that you should always just find the suitable fine that will deter that individual, because when you send somebody to imprisonment, you're imposing a cost on society, and that cost can be a great one. Now, how I would respond to that is that that has a really damaging effect on social relations. Society as well, in addition to having a deterrent effect, society needs to see justice being done, because how do you expect the ordinary man or woman on the street to pay their taxes and to comply if they feel that that certain people are immunised from the full rigours of the law? So I think that it can have a powerful cathartic effect as well as having a deterrent effect. So I would be in favour of imprisonment. One proviso to that though is we can't afford imprisonment at the moment. That and actually, if you see, we've just introduced the Community Service Amendment Act, where we're trying to get more people out of our prison system and so on because the costs are so high. So I would say it should be used but again, like in the ordinary criminal justice system, as a sanction of last resort. But it does have a powerful deterrent effect.
Okay, we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Got loads of hands flying up now.
Thank you very much. Karin Duxkin, I'm afraid I missed a lot in the beginning, apologies. I work in the marine environment, and there is something which happens quite often. We as local citizens notice something in the marine environment, or I get notified, I check it out, it's illegal. I notify relevant authorities. Usually that's 4 or 5 because they don't know who's actually responsible. They then, between them, decide not to act. You will notify them again and they will still not act. 3 weeks ago the reason was the Navy didn't have a boat. Eventually the illegal activity is over. The environment has borne the cost. The benefit is with a few individuals. They keep the media at bay by saying, we are preparing a case. A year later, no case has been taken. The question is, 1, whether there's a country where there is transparency so that if the DPP decides not to go ahead, that we can know why and that we can find out what actually went into the system so that we can uncoil the system from that end. And secondly, maybe is there another way of getting transparency earlier, but the DPP one is the core one.
Well, I think our colleague maybe at the back of the room might be best able to answer that. We do have a limited DPP reasons project, but usually in the case of fatalities where people can inquire, but I don't know whether that would be extended to, and I don't think there'd be much appetite, maybe for that. But again, maybe if there was greater transparency in terms of accessing the decision of those authorities that you've mentioned, that might give us a better clue, Shane.
There was a point raised here earlier about the DPP's office produced our annual report today, and actually the Reasons project was specifically mentioned as being resource intensive, and so this is one of the issues that it's costing a lot to do this, and so it's a reason I suppose not to do it in the future. But your question is a really good one, and I don't know from a comparative perspective as to how this is done in other jurisdictions, but what I do know is in the ordinary criminal sphere that victims of crime just in the ordinary criminal justice system for a very long time had a real issue with they'd report a crime and they'd hear nothing more about it. Okay, so from, let's say, police forces. And so what you increasingly see now, and the English model is a very good one on this, they have introduced a victims code. And so in that there's a commitment which is binding, which says after 3 to 5 days the police will get back to you. Okay, they will give you information. You will have the investigating officer's name so that you can contact him or her again. They will come back to you within 5 days. And sometimes as an enhanced service, for say a person with a disability or whatever. And so you see those kind of commitments. You can, now this has been a slow, hard-won battle in the ordinary criminal justice system because, the system, they say, it's a state versus accused diet, so victims have been left out of it. But increasingly that's no longer acceptable. We want more accommodation for victims. I would suspect that in the years to come you will see that model transposing itself also into areas that you talk about, and I hope it does. This is part of a transparent model. It has to happen.
Okay, we're nearly going to wrap up.
Could I just answer by saying that question actually tells you about how the state treats its citizens, and it's a very, very relevant question. The agency you're talking about, or the agencies that you talk about, are being paid by taxpayers' money. They are being given a role to play. They are told to carry out a particular function, and they avoid doing it. It's the stonewalling of the state that actually causes the queue in, whether it's the DPP's office or someplace else along the line. If these matters were dealt with immediately without the excuse of not having a boat, well then you might not have the bigger things occurring up along the line and the greater costs being incurred. And it is in fact a stonewalling by the state, as much it can be a stonewalling by those that appear before the Public Accounts Committee, or for example in relation to Poolbeg was a good example actually, in that where we decided that we would conduct an inquiry. For the first time ever, a standing order was used to stand down the Public Accounts Committee and not to allow it to proceed. That, in my opinion, is similar to what you're asking about, and it is a stonewalling by the state to protect the vested interest in the state or those that administer the state. But if that agency is being paid to do a job, it should do the job. And I think that we have to get to a point in this country where the culture where we accept that, where going on all over the place, be it in local or national government, if that culture is not rooted out, we will be here year in, year out discussing the same thing. As long as it's the citizen that's making the inquiry, you can ignore it. And that's not acceptable.
I think we've become sort of immune to that culture. One more question, this gentleman here, and then we'll have to wrap it up, lest another report be written in the process. Sorry, what's your name?
Yeah, okay, it's Seamus May from Irish Small Business Alliance. I spoke just before lunch as well. I think John McGuinness has stolen most of the thunder in that I wanted to say that it is really a rotten culture, a rotten ethos that's the problem. And I just want to read out two quotes that might be of assistance. This is from Dr. John Fingerton, the head of the Competition Authority at the Public Accounts Committee in 2004. He said, "It will not be until judges decide to convict people who are members of the same golf clubs of which they themselves are members that we will really see white-collar crime being tackled." Now that was not 2004, and 8 years later nobody under competition law, nobody has seen the inside of a prison, and the way we're going, they never will. Now, in relation to a very specific cartel, and I just make the point before lunch, I don't know if the same people are here or not, but Paul Beglin got 6 years in prison for a relatively minor white-collar crime. Personally, I believe he should have gone to prison, but for nothing like 6 years. But there are white-collar criminal gangs in this country going around stealing in the form of cartels and price fixing, stealing $4 billion a year of our citizens. And none of those people have ever been chased down or ever will. And in the context of that, on the 13th of April 2011, there was a very high-level meeting with Senior Gardaí and the Competition Authority in relation to a cartel. I'm quite happy to name it if you wish, a cartel that the dogs in the street know about for decades. The senior guard said this: there isn't a hope of the authority investigating this behaviour because of who you're up against and what's at stake. And one of the problems, and I want to address the media, it's a problem with the media, and it's not with journalists, it's with the people who control the media. And we in our group, we're over 30 years basically involved in investigating and looking at white-collar crime. And several newspapers, and indeed the national broadcaster, have told us that they cannot touch the type of information that we have, and we have bags of it. We have an office full of information about white-collar crime, but the government will do nothing about it. Now, it's well known that the cement industry is carved up and has been a cartel in this country for decades.
It's like Big Brother, I don't want to, we're on the air, I don't want to name names.
I didn't name a name, and I'm not going to. But the fact of the matter is, our government, this present Fine Gael government, has now taken over, via Anglo-Irish Bank, it has taken over a cement company. There are serious questions, and actually we can give the answers. There are serious questions as to whether our government is actually involved in criminal practices itself. And we would be delighted to talk to the media or anybody else that wants to have a look at it. So,
I'd say in due course we may get more information to that. It's funny actually, I remember getting a call from a barrister to tell me, and I heard it wrong, I thought it was a hedge fund cartel case, and I was thrilled, and I thought it was a big scoop, and I was dying, and it was indeed a cartel case, and it did involve hedges, but of the green variety that one might cut at the weekend, and a lot of public money was spent prosecuting. I thought it was a great scoop, that hedge fund case. I think my job was very, very easy today. Due to the calibre of the speakers and indeed the report underlying today's conference. I'd like to thank all of the speakers, to all of those who contributed. It is a superb report, and I think it's given a lot of us here in media and whatever professions we're in a lot of food for thought, and I hope that it's one that won't just sit in the shelf, but that will actually get some positive outcomes from it. So I'd like to thank each of the speakers, and I'll hand you back to John. I don't think we've gone too much over our time.
Many thanks, Dearbhail. I don't think I'd do justice to the seminar and to the contributions today, but try to summarise everything that was said. The conversation, the discussion was so rich, so textured. I know I'm going away with a lot more questions to be answered. I hope you do too. We've made the point before that reform is needed, it is possible, and we can't waste any time in introducing it. And whether we're strengthening our institutions, introducing new laws, or attempting to educate the public on the cost of corruption and the way in which it can be tackled, the measure of our efforts will be seen in a change of behaviour and a change in attitudes, and ultimately a change in culture.